Lorenzo sat behind the wheel of his SUV, tapping his fingers against the steering wheel. The road stretched out in front of him, empty, flanked by tall grass swaying in the summer heat. He glanced at his watch, muttering under his breath. He had an important meeting in less than an hour. But as the car sped along the narrow rural road, a jarring bump was followed by the unmistakable thump, thump, thump of a flat tire. "Of course," he said, his voice dripping with frustration. He sighed and pulled over to the side of the road, his luxury vehicle kicking up a cloud of dust. The heat hit him as soon as he stepped out, and he winced, adjusting his suit jacket and loosening his tie. Lorenzo knelt beside the tire, which was clearly shredded, pieces of rubber peeling away. He glanced down the empty road and back at his phone. No signal. He cursed under his breath and tucked his phone back into his pocket. He stared at the tire, feeling helpless. He had never had to change a tire himself before. In his world, someone always handled these kinds of issues: assistants, chauffeurs, service crews. But out here, on this deserted road with no cell signal, there was no one, just him, his broken-down SUV, and the sweltering heat. Lorenzo's thoughts drifted back reluctantly to a time long ago when he was a young man, stranded and needing help. He remembered the faces of the people who ignored him, those who looked the other way. It left a bitter taste, a reason he hated relying on others. He shook his head, trying to push the memory away. The sun beat down harder, the road shimmering in the distance, and the tension in his chest grew. The sky above was clear, and the nearest sign of civilization seemed far away. He needed to find a solution before dusk. Suddenly, Lorenzo squinted. Someone, or rather, something was moving toward him, a silhouette on the horizon, getting closer. He straightened up, trying to make out the figure. It was a kid no more than 14 wearing a faded t-shirt and a pair of old sneakers. As the boy got closer, Lorenzo could see his determined expression. "Hey, mister, got trouble with your car?" the boy called out, stopping a few steps away from the SUV. He looked directly at Lorenzo, his eyes clear and curious. Lorenzo hesitated, feeling a strange mix of relief and caution. "Yeah, flat tire," he said, trying to keep his voice level. "I don't exactly know how to fix it." The boy nodded, moving closer. He glanced at the shredded rubber, and then at Lorenzo. "I can do it. My dad showed me how." Lorenzo frowned. You can really do it?" He stared at the boy, who seemed so sure of himself. Lorenzo was too used to relying on strangers, much less a kid. The boy looked up and smiled slightly. "Yeah, it's just a tire, mister. No big deal." The boy stood up, dusting his knees off. "The spare's usually under the back. Mind if I take a look?" Lorenzo gave a short nod, feeling uneasy but with no other option. He stepped aside, watching as the boy moved confidently to the back of the SUV, opening the hatch. The boy found the tools and the spare without hesitation. Not wasting a moment, he began loosening the lug nuts, the wrench moving back and forth with a rhythmic clank. "You're really doing this?" Lorenzo murmured, more to himself. He could feel sweat forming on his back, a combination of the heat and the unease of the situation. The boy worked quickly, ignoring the dirt and the weight of the tire. After some time, he looked up, a bit of sweat dripping down his forehead. "You all right there, mister? You're looking kind of pale." Lorenzo cleared his throat and straightened his suit jacket. "I'm fine. Just not used to this kind of thing." The boy smiled again, and Lorenzo couldn't help but notice how genuine it was. "It's no problem, really. You just got to know where to look and how to get your hands dirty." Lorenzo stayed silent, watching as the boy finished attaching the spare tire. The boy worked quickly, tightening the bolts, then stood up, wiping his hands on his jeans. He stepped back and gave Lorenzo a thumbs up. "All done." Lorenzo blinked in disbelief. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his wallet, and took out a few bills, holding them out to the boy. "Here, for your trouble. I appreciate it." The boy shook his head immediately, backing away. "Nah, I don't need that. Just wanted to help." You seemed like you could use it. Lorenzo frowned, holding the money out awkwardly. No, really, I insist. But the boy just smiled, shook his head again, and started walking away, waving over his shoulder. Take care, mister. Good luck with wherever you're going. Lorenzo watched, stunned, as the boy disappeared down the road, the same way he had come. The bills were still in his hand. He stood there for a moment, then let out a long breath. The unease hadn't disappeared. If anything, it had grown. He wasn't used to this someone doing a simple favor with no expectation of reward. He turned back to the SUV, slipping the money back into his wallet as he climbed into the driver's seat and started the car. But as he drove on, his thoughts weren't clear. Something about that encounter wouldn't let him go. A nagging feeling. A sense of being unsettled. He pressed his lips together, focusing on the road ahead, trying to push the thoughts away. But they stuck with him long after he left the empty road behind. His mind wandered, replaying the entire encounter over and over again, the boy's smile, the way he refused the money, the casual take care he threw over his shoulder. It felt wrong somehow, not the boy's actions, but Lorenzo's own reaction. He wasn't used to not being in control, to not having the power that money brought. He pulled into his driveway, the automatic gates opening as his luxury SUV rumbled through. The house loomed ahead, modern and sleek, the kind of place where everything looked perfect but felt cold. Lorenzo parked, shutting off the engine. He sat there for a moment, staring blankly out of the windshield. Hey, hon, you're late. Lorenzo looked up, startled out of his thoughts by his wife, Elowen, standing at the door. She was smiling, but her expression shifted slightly as she saw his face. She stepped closer, concern creasing her brow. Everything all right? Yeah, Lorenzo said quickly, forcing a smile. He grabbed his briefcase and climbed out, shutting the door harder than he meant to. Had some trouble on the road. Just a flat. Elowen folded her arms, tilting her head. A flat tire? Did you manage to fix it? No. He hesitated, then added, a kid showed up. He fixed it for me. He gave a small shrug, trying to sound casual. Didn't he want anything for it? Elowen raised an eyebrow. Didn't he want anything, really? Lorenzo nodded, his expression growing more serious. Refused the money I offered him. Just helped and left. She studied him for a moment. That's kind of amazing, actually. People aren't usually that nice for nothing these days. Lorenzo just grunted in response, stepping past her into the house. Yeah, well. He paused, his frustration bubbling to the surface. I guess he wasn't. He wasn't sure why, but her words irritated him. Maybe it was because she was right. Maybe it was because he knew he would never have done the same. The evening moved on, but the strange feeling refused to leave him. At dinner, he barely touched his food. His two kids, Zara and Blaze, were chattering about their day, but their voices felt distant, muffled. Elowen noticed, giving him a sideways glance. All right, what's going on? She asked, leaning her elbows on the table. You've been acting weird since you got home. Lorenzo looked up, blinking. He shook his head. It's nothing. Just… I don't know. He paused, the words almost catching in his throat. It's that kid. I can't stop thinking about it. Zara, his daughter, looked up from her phone, her curiosity piqued. What kid? Lorenzo sighed, setting his fork down and leaning back in his chair. I told you. The kid that helped me with the tire. He wouldn't take any money. He just did it like it was the most normal thing in the world. And then he walked away. He rubbed his forehead, trying to make sense of his own frustration. I don't understand it. Blaze, his son, smirked. Maybe he's just a good person, Dad. Lorenzo shot him a look but didn't respond. Elowen watched him carefully, her expression softening. Sometimes people do good things just because they can, Lorenzo. Not everyone expects something in return. Lorenzo frowned. Yeah, well, it doesn't make sense to me. Everyone wants something. He stood up, pushing his chair back with a scrape. Anyway, I'm going to get some air. Elowen nodded slowly, her eyes following him as he walked out to the backyard. He stood there for a while, hands in his pockets, looking out at the manicured lawn. He wanted to dismiss it, to forget about the kid and move on. But there was something there, something he couldn't shake. The look in the boy's eyes. The way he just smiled and walked away as if helping was enough. Lorenzo went to bed late that night, his thoughts still in disarray. Elowen was asleep by the time he finally climbed in beside her. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, trying to push away the nagging sense of incompleteness. It was just a flat tire. It wasn't supposed to mean anything. But somehow it did. The next morning, Lorenzo woke up with a sense of purpose even if he couldn't quite put his finger on why. He had to find the boy. He didn't know what he would say, or even if the kid would be there, but he had to try. He got dressed quickly, throwing on casual clothes instead of his usual suit. Elowen looked up from her coffee, her eyebrows lifting in surprise. Going somewhere? Lorenzo nodded, already heading for the door. I'm going back to where I got the flat. Elowen blinked. To find the kid? Yeah, Lorenzo said, pausing at the door. He gave her a quick smile. Don't wait up for me. He climbed back into the SUV, his mind focused. He remembered the stretch of road, the feeling of helplessness when he first saw the tire was flat. It didn't take long to get there, but the landscape seemed different today, less threatening, more familiar. Lorenzo slowed the car as he approached the spot. He parked on the side, stepping out, and looked around. The sun was already warming the air, and he could feel sweat gathering on his neck. He scanned the distance, his eyes narrowing. And then he saw a house, small and worn, standing back from the road. He walked towards it, feeling a strange mixture of hope and anxiety. What if he was wrong? What if it wasn't the boy's house? He shook the thought away and kept walking. The front yard was unkempt, a few rusted toys scattered around. Lorenzo stopped at the edge of the walkway, taking a deep breath before stepping up to the door. He raised his hand and knocked firmly. There was a rustling from inside, and then the door creaked open. A woman stood there, her eyes widening in surprise. She looked at Lorenzo, his expensive shoes, the watch on his wrist, the determined look on his face. Can I help you? She asked, her voice cautious. Lorenzo cleared his throat. Yeah? I'm looking for a kid 14, I think. He helped me with my car yesterday. The woman's expression softened. She nodded slightly. You mean Finian? Lorenzo nodded. Yes, Finian. I wanted to thank him properly. The woman stepped back, glancing over her shoulder. Finian! Come here! Someone's here for you. Lorenzo heard footsteps, and then Finian appeared, his eyes widening in recognition. Oh, hey, mister, he said, a smile breaking across his face. Lorenzo took a step forward. Finian, I wanted to find you. I couldn't stop thinking about what you did for me yesterday. I need to do something for you in return. Finian shook his head, the smile never leaving his face. I told you, mister, it was no big deal. I just wanted to help. Lorenzo looked at him, trying to understand the sincerity, the kindness. It was so foreign to him, but he knew he couldn't leave it like this. Please, Lorenzo said. There has to be something I can do for you, for your family. Finian glanced at his mother, who gave a small nod. He looked back at Lorenzo, his eyes thoughtful. Well, he said slowly, maybe there is one thing. Lorenzo felt a flicker of hope. Anything. Finian's smile grew wider. How about you come in for breakfast? We don't have much, but it would be nice. Lorenzo blinked, taken aback. He opened his mouth, closed it again, and then nodded. All right, I'd like that. The door swung open wider, and Lorenzo stepped inside, feeling something shift within him. He didn't know what it was, but maybe, just maybe, this was a start. Lorenzo parked his SUV in front of Finian's house, the gravel crunching under the tires as he came to a stop. The morning sun was warm, casting a gentle glow over the yard. Today was the first real day of work. He had brought along a small team of workers to start assessing the house for repairs, roofing, plumbing, and a few other fixes that needed attention. He took a deep breath as he stepped out of the vehicle and made his way to the front door. Before he could knock, the door swung open, and Finian was already standing there, a wide grin on his face. "Hey, mister!" Finian greeted enthusiastically. "Ready to get your hands dirty?" Lorenzo let out a soft chuckle. "I might leave the heavy lifting to the professionals, but I'm here to help however I can." Finian looked behind him and saw his mom in the background, a small smile on her face. "Come in," Finian said, opening the door wider. "Mom made some coffee. I think you're going to need it if you're going to hang around here today." Lorenzo nodded and stepped inside. The familiarity of the kitchen, the smell of fresh coffee, brought back a warmth he wasn't accustomed to. Finian's mother, Elowen, smiled politely from the counter. "Mr. Lorenzo, nice to see you again. You really didn't have to come yourself today, you know," she said, handing him a steaming mug of coffee. Lorenzo accepted the mug, giving her a grateful smile. "I wanted to. It's important for me to be part of this, not just give orders and leave it at that." Elowen nodded, appreciation evident in her eyes. "Well, we're grateful, and you're welcome here, always." She looked past Lorenzo to the workers who had begun unloading tools outside. They looked ready to get started. Lorenzo glanced over his shoulder, seeing his small crew getting organized. He nodded and turned back to Finian. "How about you show me around the place so we can see what needs the most attention?" Finian shrugged, still grinning. "Sure thing, mister. It's not a mansion like yours, though." There was a teasing glint in his eye as he led the way. Lorenzo smiled back. "I'm here to make it the best version of itself. Lead the way." Finian took him through the house, pointing out the areas that needed the most help. The roof had a couple of bad leaks, the kitchen plumbing was unreliable, and there were patches of floor that were worn almost to the point of breaking. Lorenzo made mental notes, glancing around the rooms. The house might have been small, but it was filled with character. It wasn't just walls and a roof, it was clearly a home, filled with love. After their tour, Finian led Lorenzo back to the front yard, where the workers had set up a temporary workstation. The men were talking amongst themselves, and one of them, a burly man named Thatcher, waved Lorenzo over. "All right, boss, we're ready to get started," Thatcher said. "Roof looks like the first thing we need to tackle." Lorenzo nodded. "Let us do it. Just let me know if you need anything." Thatcher gave him a thumbs up before heading to the truck to gather some supplies. Lorenzo turned back to Finian, who was watching with an amused smile. "Not used to getting your hands dirty, huh?" Finian teased. Lorenzo chuckled, shaking his head. "No, not really. But it feels good. Different but good." Finian nodded, his eyes growing more serious. "You know, it really means a lot to us, you doing all this." Lorenzo looked down at the boy, feeling something tighten in his chest. "I should be thanking you, Finian. You helped me more than you know." Finian tilted his head, his expression curious. "How is that?" Lorenzo hesitated, trying to put his thoughts into words. "I've spent a lot of my life disconnected, I guess. Focused on work, on money, on everything that doesn't really matter. Meeting you, it reminded me of what's important. Family. Community. Helping others." Finian gave a small smile, looking away for a moment before meeting Lorenzo's eyes again. "You're not so bad, mister. Most people just drive by when they see someone in trouble." Lorenzo felt a pang of regret. He knew that not long ago, he might have been one of those people. He nodded, his voice quiet. "I'm trying to be better." Finian's mom stepped out onto the porch, her hands resting on her hips as she watched the workers. "I have to say, I've never seen the place so busy," she said with a laugh. It's a good kind of busy, though. Lorenzo smiled at her. We'll get everything taken care of. I promise. She nodded, her smile softening. Thank you, Mr. Lorenzo. You have no idea how much this means to us. Lorenzo glanced at Finian, who was watching his mom with a gentle smile, then turned back to Elowen. It means a lot to me, too. The day wore on, and the crew worked steadily. Finian helped where he could, carrying tools, handing supplies. Lorenzo found himself pitching in more than he expected, holding ladders, passing nails, even hammering a few boards into place under Thatcher's watchful eye. He felt the sweat on his back, the ache in his muscles, and it was good. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, a feeling of accomplishment, of genuine effort. As the sun began to set, the crew wrapped up for the day. The roof was patched, and the plumbing in the kitchen had been improved. It wasn't finished, but it was a start. Lorenzo stood back, watching as Finian ran inside to test the water. The boy's laughter echoed through the house when the tap worked without a hitch. Elowen stepped up beside Lorenzo, her eyes filled with emotion. You've already made such a difference, Mr. Lorenzo. I don't know how we can ever thank you. Lorenzo shook his head, smiling. You don't need to thank me. I'm the one who owes you. He looked at Finian, who had come back out, grinning ear to ear. I think I'm getting more out of this than you realize. Finian ran up to Lorenzo, stopping in front of him. You're coming back tomorrow, right? There's still a lot to do. Lorenzo nodded, resting a hand on Finian's shoulder. Of course. I'm in this until the end, Finian. Finian beamed, and Elowen nodded in appreciation. The three of them stood there for a moment, watching the crew pack up. The sense of something meaningful filled the air between them. Lorenzo knew he had a long way to go, not just in the repairs, but in understanding this new path he was on. But for now, he was content to take it one day at a time, knowing that every nail, every board, every small effort was leading him to something better. Lorenzo sat at the modest wooden table in Finian's kitchen. The place was small, tidy but worn. The scent of coffee and eggs filled the air. Finian's mother moved around the kitchen, preparing breakfast. Lorenzo shifted uncomfortably in his seat, not used to being in a setting like this. Everything about it felt alien. Finian sat across from Lorenzo, a grin still on his face. So, what brings you back, really? Finian asked, his curiosity evident. Lorenzo scratched his chin, choosing his words carefully. I couldn't get yesterday out of my mind, he said. He glanced around the kitchen at the simple curtains, the cracked linoleum floor. You helped me, and I wanted to repay you somehow. It just didn't sit right with me, leaving it like that. Finian shrugged, taking a sip of his juice. It's really no big deal. I mean, we're supposed to help each other, right? Lorenzo paused. The simplicity of Finian's words made him feel almost foolish. His entire life had been built on the idea that nothing came for free, that every action had a price, a return, an angle. Yet here was Finian, treating kindness as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Finian's mom set a plate in front of Lorenzo's scrambled eggs and toast. It's not much, but you're welcome to it, she said, offering him a gentle smile. Lorenzo looked down at the plate, then back up at her. He swallowed, nodding. Thank you. It's more than enough. They ate in silence for a few moments. The clinking of forks on plates was the only sound. Lorenzo kept glancing at Finian, the way the boy interacted with his mom, the warmth in his eyes. It was such a stark contrast to the way his own household had felt lately, cold, distant, more like a transaction than a family. Finian looked up suddenly, his eyes catching Lorenzo's. So, what's it like, being successful and all that? Lorenzo paused, chewing thoughtfully. It's busy, he said finally. A lot of meetings, a lot of responsibility. He looked at Finian, seeing the curiosity there. I guess most people think it's all fancy parties and luxury, but it can be pretty lonely. Finian nodded slowly. I get that. I mean, people probably see the fancy car and think you've got it all, right? Lorenzo smiled slightly, a bitter edge to it. Yeah, something like that. He looked down at his plate, pushing the eggs around. Sometimes I think I've lost sight of what really matters, the things that, well, that make life worth it. Finian tilted his head, considering. Maybe you just need a reminder. He smiled again, that same open, genuine smile. Helping someone, being there, it feels good, right? Lorenzo blinked, taken aback. He set his fork down, nodding slowly. Yeah, it does. Finian's mom cleared her throat softly, breaking the moment. We don't have much, but we try to help when we can. It's how my mom raised me, and it's how I'm raising Finian. Lorenzo nodded, glancing at her, then back at Finian. You've done a good job, he said, his voice sincere. Finian is a good kid. The room fell into a comfortable silence, the kind Lorenzo wasn't used to. He leaned back in his chair, letting himself relax for the first time in what felt like a long time. It wasn't about the luxury or the material things. It was just about being there, sharing a meal, connecting. As the meal finished, Finian stood up, taking Lorenzo's empty plate and stacking it with his own. So, what now, mister? You going to be all right? He asked, a teasing smile playing on his lips. Lorenzo let out a small laugh, shaking his head. I think so. He hesitated, then looked Finian in the eye. I really do want to do something for you, for your family. Not because I owe you, but because… He trailed off, unsure of how to finish. Well, because I want to. Finian exchanged a look with his mother. She gave a small, encouraging nod. Finian turned back to Lorenzo, shrugging. I mean, we could use a few things around here, but it's not why I helped you. Lorenzo smiled, feeling a weight lifting off his shoulders. I understand that, and I want to help anyway. He stood, extending his hand to Finian's mom. Thank you for breakfast. It meant more to me than you probably realize. She took his hand, giving it a firm shake. You're welcome. You're always welcome here. Lorenzo nodded, turning back to Finian. I'll be in touch. Maybe we can figure something out, something that's meaningful. Finian smiled, giving Lorenzo a thumbs up. Sure thing, mister. Just come by whenever. Lorenzo stepped out of the house, the screen door creaking shut behind him. He took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of the morning sun on his face. The road stretched out ahead of him, the same road that had felt so empty just the day before. Today, it felt different, less lonely. He climbed into his SUV, starting the engine. He watched the house for a moment in the rearview mirror before pulling away. The sense of incompleteness was still there, but it was changing. He had begun something today, and maybe, just maybe, it was the start of something better. Lorenzo drove back home, his thoughts no longer filled with the frustration of the previous day. Instead, he thought about what Finian had said about helping for the sake of it. He felt a spark of something, hope, maybe. It was small, but it was there. He pulled into the driveway of his house. The gates closed behind him as he stepped out. He could see Elowen standing by the door, her arms crossed, watching him. There was a question in her eyes, and Lorenzo smiled as he walked up to her. So, she asked, her eyebrows raising. Did you find him? Lorenzo nodded, stopping in front of her. Yeah, I did. He paused, then added, had breakfast with them. Elowen looked surprised, then smiled. Breakfast, huh? Sounds like a step in the right direction. Lorenzo nodded again, his smile growing. Yes. Yeah, I think it was. He glanced back at the car, then at his wife. And you know what? I think I want to do more. Not just for them, but for others too. It felt right. Elowen stepped closer, resting a hand on his arm. Maybe you're finally seeing what really matters, Lorenzo. Lorenzo looked at her, his expression softening. Maybe I am. They stood there for a moment, the silence between them filled with a new understanding. Lorenzo knew he had a long way to go, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the right path. He wasn't sure where it would lead, but he knew he had to follow it. And with that thought, he stepped inside, ready to see where this journey would take him next. Lorenzo arrived early the next morning, his SUV parked in the usual spot in front of Finian's house. The crisp morning air carried the scent of fresh cut grass from a nearby field. He looked at the worn house, now with its roof patched and the signs of improvement visible. Today, they were going to continue with the plumbing and begin replacing some of the worn-out floorboards in the living room. He stepped out of the car and saw Finian sitting on the porch, waiting for him. The boy's face lit up as soon as he saw Lorenzo. "Hey, mister, you're back," Finian said, jumping up and running over to meet him. His excitement was contagious, and Lorenzo couldn't help but smile. "Of course I am," Lorenzo said, ruffling Finian's hair. "I told you I'd be here until it's all done." Finian nodded, then lowered his voice slightly, a touch of seriousness in his tone. "You know, Mom keeps saying we don't need all this, but I think she's really happy you're helping. She doesn't want to say it, but I can tell." Lorenzo glanced over at the front door, where Elowen stood watching them. She had a small smile on her face. He nodded at Finian, his voice quiet. "Sometimes it's hard to accept help, even when we need it. I know that feeling." Finian looked up. Elowen blinked, her mouth opening slightly in surprise. "Mr. Lorenzo, that's more than we could ever ask for." Finian's eyes were wide, his voice filled with excitement. "Really, mister? You'd do that for us?" Lorenzo nodded, looking at both of them. "Yes, I want to. This isn't about paying you back, it's about doing something good. Something meaningful." He looked directly at Elowen. "You've given me something I didn't even know I needed, and I want to give back." Elowen swallowed, her eyes glistening. She glanced at Finian, who was practically bouncing in his seat, then back at Lorenzo. "I don't know what to say. We've always managed on our own, but I can see that you really mean this." Lorenzo smiled. "I do. And you don't have to decide right now. Just think about it." Elowen looked down at her plate, her hands resting on the table. After a moment, she nodded. "All right, we'll think about it. But I want you to know we're grateful, Mr. Lorenzo. We really are." Finian grinned, looking at Lorenzo. "I think it would be amazing, mister. I could finally have a room that doesn't leak when it rains." Lorenzo chuckled, nodding. "That's the plan, Finian. We'll make sure you've got a room that's warm and dry." The rest of breakfast went by with laughter and excitement. Finian talked about all the things he wanted for his room, maybe a new bed, a desk where he could do his schoolwork. Elowen listened quietly, her eyes soft, her smile never fading. After breakfast, Lorenzo went back outside, meeting with Thatcher and the rest of the crew. He pulled Thatcher aside, explaining his new plan for the house, the renovations he wanted to start. Thatcher nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's a big project, boss, but we can handle it. Might take a few weeks," Thatcher said. Lorenzo smiled. "That's fine. I want to make sure it's done right." Thatcher nodded again, giving him a thumbs up before heading back to the crew to start on the day's work. Lorenzo stood there for a moment, looking back at the house. He watched as Finian and Elowen stepped out onto the porch. Elowen waved at him, and their eyes met. There was something there, something that made Lorenzo's chest tighten. Gratitude, yes, but also something deeper. A connection he hadn't felt in a long time. He turned back to the workers, taking a deep breath. Today, they would continue with the plumbing and start on the floors. But soon, they would be doing much more. And Lorenzo knew that this wasn't just about fixing a house. It was about building something new, something meaningful. The day wore on, and Lorenzo found himself getting more involved than ever before. It wasn't just about the physical work, it was about feeling a connection, a sense of purpose that had been missing for so long. He helped carry tools, hold boards in place, and even got up on the ladder to assist with the roof. The air was thick with the sound of hammers, saws, and the occasional banter between the workers, but Lorenzo didn't mind. He was no longer the observer. He was part of something. Finian, always nearby, was eager to help with every task. His energy was contagious, and Lorenzo found himself smiling as the boy moved from one task to the next with the determination of someone much older. His enthusiasm, as well as the fact that he was willing to get his hands dirty, reminded Lorenzo of the simple things he had once taken for granted: the willingness to work hard, to invest in something meaningful, and to appreciate the smaller moments in life. Elowen watched from the porch, her eyes following them as they worked. There was a quiet contentment on her face, a small smile that conveyed her deep appreciation for the work and the company. She didn't have to say much. Her presence alone told Lorenzo everything he needed to know. She wasn't accustomed to this kind of help, but she was grateful nonetheless. And as the hours passed, Lorenzo found himself getting more and more involved in the work. He hadn't been much for manual labor in years, but under Thatcher's patient guidance, he found that he was capable of more than he expected. His hands were calloused and his muscles sore, but the sense of accomplishment was real. It wasn't just about the repairs, it was about rediscovering something he had lost over time. He had spent years building his empire, but here, on this small plot of land, he felt grounded. By the time lunch came, the crew had made visible progress. The roof was nearly finished, the kitchen plumbing had been improved, and the living room floor was starting to take shape. Lorenzo wiped the sweat from his forehead, feeling a tinge of exhaustion in his back. He looked over at Finian, who was still moving from task to task, determined to contribute however he could. Finian's dedication was something Lorenzo admired, but he also noticed something else: the boy was completely unbothered by the work. He didn't hesitate to carry the tools, run back and forth, or get dirty in the process. Elowen came out with a tray of sandwiches and lemonade for everyone. The crew gathered around the porch to eat. It was a simple meal: sandwiches, lemonade, and some chips, but somehow, it felt like a feast. There was an abundance of laughter, joking, and camaraderie that filled the air. It wasn't just a lunch. It was a moment of connection, of family, of shared effort. Finian chatted animatedly with Thatcher about the work they were doing, asking questions about the plumbing and joking about how much of the roof still needed work. Thatcher, a big, burly man with a hearty laugh, took the time to explain things in simple terms for Finian, clearly enjoying the boy's enthusiasm. Lorenzo sat next to Elowen, his eyes flicking to the crew, and then back to her. She gave him a quiet, contented smile, her eyes shining with appreciation, but there was a subtle sadness to her gaze too. It was as if she was grateful for the help, but also reminded of the struggles they had faced in the past, struggles that now seemed far behind them. Lorenzo took a sip of lemonade, feeling the coolness settle in his chest. The laughter and light conversation were a stark contrast to the quiet, lonely dinners at his own home. Here, he saw what real connection felt like: working together, sharing moments, being present. It wasn't about the size of the house or the amount of money spent on repairs. It was about creating something lasting, something that mattered. After lunch, the crew got back to work, but Lorenzo found himself standing with Elowen on the porch again, watching as Finian ran around with a tool in his hand, handing supplies to the workers, and helping where he could. It was hard to ignore the sense of fulfillment that washed over Lorenzo. He had never expected to find this level of satisfaction in a place like this, with people like them. The boy's laughter echoed in the yard, and Lorenzo couldn't help but smile. There was something about it, something pure and simple, like Finian had found joy in helping, not because it was expected, but because it was the right thing to do. Lorenzo felt a little guilty, as if he had forgotten how to do that, how to find joy in the simple acts of kindness and effort. But now, with Finian and Elowen, he was beginning to rediscover it. Elowen's voice brought him back to the present. "If you don't mind me asking," she said softly, her tone gentle, "what made you do all this?" Lorenzo paused, considering her question for a moment. He looked at Finian, who was eagerly carrying a pile of tools, and then back at Elowen. Her eyes were filled with curiosity, but there was also something deeper, something that told Lorenzo she understood the weight of what he had done. "I think it's because I realized I was missing something," he said slowly, his voice quieter than before. "I've spent my whole life chasing success, thinking that was what mattered. But meeting Finian, seeing the way he helped me without expecting anything in return, it made me realize there's more to life than just money and power." Elowen nodded, her eyes softening as she took in his words. She didn't need to say anything. Lorenzo could see the understanding in her gaze, the acknowledgement that sometimes the most important things were the things you couldn't buy or control. "Sometimes," Elowen said quietly, "it takes something simple to show us what really matters." Lorenzo smiled, his thoughts drifting back to the earlier days of his life when things were simpler. When helping others came naturally, before everything became about profits and success. "Yeah, and I think I needed that reminder," he said softly. They stood there for a moment, watching Finian's joy as he ran around, helping wherever he could. Lorenzo couldn't remember the last time he felt this at peace. His life had been so full of distractions, of goals, of acquisitions, but here, surrounded by people who weren't asking for anything, he realized that he was beginning to understand what true fulfillment really was. As the afternoon wore on, the crew continued to work steadily. Lorenzo, despite his initial hesitation, found himself getting more and more involved in the work. Every board he held, every nail he hammered, made him feel more connected to this place. It wasn't just about the repairs, it was about building something real, something lasting. The sun began to dip lower in the sky as the workers packed up for the day. The roof was nearly finished, the plumbing was in place, and the kitchen was looking better than it had in years. Lorenzo stood back, watching as Finian ran inside to test the water once again. The boy's laughter rang out as the tap worked, the sound carrying across the yard. Elowen stepped up beside Lorenzo, her eyes filled with emotion. "You've already made such a difference, Mr. Lorenzo," she said quietly. "I don't know how we can ever thank you." Lorenzo shook his head, a small smile tugging at his lips. "You don't need to thank me. I'm the one who owes you." He glanced over at Finian, who had come back outside, grinning from ear to ear. "I think I'm getting more out of this than you realize." Finian ran up to Lorenzo, stopping right in front of him, excitement in his eyes. "You're coming back tomorrow, right? There's still a lot to do." Lorenzo nodded, resting a hand on Finian's shoulder. "Of course. I'm in this until the end, Finian." Finian beamed at him, and Elowen nodded, her expression full of appreciation. The three of them stood there for a moment, watching as the crew packed up their tools, the sense of something meaningful filling the air between them. Lorenzo knew he had a long way to go, not just in the repairs, but in understanding this new path he was on. But for now, he was content to take it one day at a time, knowing that every nail, every board, every small effort was leading him to something better. Lorenzo stood on the porch of the house, watching as the last of the workers packed up their equipment. The day had been long, but it had been productive, and the house was beginning to look like a real home. The repairs were coming along, but the real transformation wasn't in the roof or the plumbing, it was in the atmosphere. There was a sense of community here, a sense of purpose. It wasn't about the work being done, it was about the people who were doing it together. He looked over at Finian, who was standing on the porch with him. The boy was still grinning from ear to ear, his excitement infectious. "You know, Mr. Finian said, his voice filled with awe. "It really looks different. It feels like a real home now." Lorenzo nodded, his hand resting lightly on the railing. "It does," he agreed, his voice quieter than usual. "It's not just the walls or the roof, Finian. It's the people inside them that make it a home. And I'm glad I could help make this place better for you and your family." Finian smiled up at him, his eyes bright. "I think it's already better. You've made a difference, mister. More than anyone else would have." Lorenzo felt a lump in his throat. He had come to do something kind for Finian and his family, but now he realized that in the process, they had given him something far more valuable, something he had long lost, a sense of belonging. Elowen joined them on the porch, looking out at the house, her gaze lingering on the newly repaired roof and the improvements to the exterior. She didn't need to say anything, but Lorenzo could feel her gratitude in the way she stood, the quiet appreciation in her eyes. Her family was safe, they had a home, and with the repairs, they now had a future. "You know, I never thought I'd see this day," Elowen said, her voice soft, almost as if she were speaking to herself. "It feels like a dream." Lorenzo looked over at her. "It's not a dream," he said firmly. "It's real. And it's something you deserve." She smiled, her eyes glistening with emotion. "We've never had anyone do anything like this for us. I don't know how to thank you enough, Lorenzo. You've changed our lives." Lorenzo shook his head, his voice steady. "I haven't changed your lives. You've changed mine." He paused, trying to find the words to explain. "I've spent so much time focusing on the wrong things: work, money, power. I forgot about what really mattered. But you and Finian," he paused again, "you've reminded me of what's important. And I'm grateful for that." Elowen's eyes softened, and she reached out, her hand resting gently on his arm. "It means more than you know, Lorenzo." Finian, who had been quietly listening, suddenly jumped up, his eyes wide. "Hey, mister! I've been thinking maybe when this is all done, I can help you with something. You know, with whatever you need. You've been helping us, so maybe I can help you too." Lorenzo chuckled, ruffling Finian's hair. "You've already helped me more than you know, Finian. But I'll definitely take you up on that offer." Finian grinned, bouncing on his feet. "Great! I'll be ready." Lorenzo's smile softened. The boy was filled with so much energy and optimism it was contagious. And for the first time in a long time, Lorenzo found himself truly believing that the world wasn't as empty as it sometimes seemed. Maybe it wasn't about chasing success, or wealth, or status. Maybe it was about connections like this, about making a difference in someone else's life just because it's the right thing to do. As the evening settled in, Elowen and Lorenzo stood together, gazing at the house. The sunset cast a warm glow over everything, and Lorenzo felt a deep sense of peace wash over him. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing: he was on the right path now. "It's amazing how much can change in such a short time," Elowen said, her voice filled with wonder. Lorenzo nodded, his eyes still on the house. "Yeah, it is. And I think there's more to come. This is just the beginning." Elowen turned to him, her expression full of warmth. "You've given us hope, Lorenzo. Something we didn't even know we were missing." Lorenzo met her gaze, his heart swelling with emotion. "I'm glad," he said simply. "I'm glad I could be a part of it." They stood there in silence for a while, just watching the day fade into night, the stars beginning to twinkle in the sky. It wasn't about the things he had accumulated over the years. It wasn't about the fancy cars or the suits or the boardrooms. What mattered now, what truly mattered, was the connection between them all. It was about family. It was about love. It was about helping, not because you have to, but because it's what makes life worth living. Lorenzo finally turned to Elowen, his voice softer than before. "You know, I think I've learned more in the past few days than I have in the past few years. I don't want to forget this feeling." Elowen smiled, her hand still resting on his arm. "You want tea, Lorenzo? You want tea?" As the night fell, they went inside, where Finian was already busy planning his new room. Lorenzo felt a sense of fulfillment, something he hadn't felt in a long time. The house was starting to feel like a home, but more than that, he felt like he was finally beginning to understand what it meant to be truly alive, to live with purpose, to be part of something that mattered. The repairs weren't finished, and there was still a lot of work to do. But for the first time, Lorenzo felt ready for whatever came next. The journey had just begun, and he knew it would take him places he had never imagined. And with Finian and Elowen by his side, it didn't feel so daunting anymore. Lorenzo smiled as he watched Finian talk excitedly about his room. He was no longer just a man with the answers or the wealth. He was part of something real, a family that had shown him the true meaning of connection, of giving without expecting anything in return. And for the first time in a long time, Lorenzo felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The next morning, Lorenzo woke up early, even before the sun had fully risen. The house was still quiet, and the weight of the night's thoughts lingered in his mind. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't worried about meetings or business deals. His mind was focused on something else, the feeling of purpose, of connection, that had been rekindled in him over the past few days. He knew today would be another step in the journey, and he was ready for it. Lorenzo dressed quickly, throwing on a pair of comfortable jeans and a t-shirt, something he hadn't worn in years. He had spent so much of his life in suits and ties that he had forgotten what it felt like to be truly comfortable. As he grabbed his keys and walked out the door, he felt a strange sense of peace. The drive to Finn and Elowen's house was quiet. The road stretched out ahead of him, the early morning mist still hanging in the air. He passed the familiar landscape, the same worn buildings and fields, but today it looked different, clearer, more meaningful. As he neared the house, he felt a sense of anticipation building in his chest. When he pulled into the driveway, the crew was already unloading their equipment. The house stood before him, imperfect yet full of promise. He could already see the difference in the exterior, the way the roof had been patched, the new windows glinting in the morning light. But what stood out the most to him was the family inside. Finn was waiting for him on the porch, his face lighting up when he saw Lorenzo's SUV. The boy was full of energy, always ready to jump into action, and today was no different. He waved excitedly as Lorenzo parked the car. "Hey, mister!" Finn called out as Lorenzo got out. "You're here early today!" Lorenzo smiled, feeling the warmth of the boy's enthusiasm. "I wanted to make sure we get everything done on time, Finn." Finn nodded seriously, then grinned. "We're gonna make it even better today, right?" Lorenzo nodded. "Exactly. Let us get to work." Finn showed Lorenzo inside, where the crew had already started on the plumbing. The kitchen was nearly finished, and they were working on replacing the floors in the living room. The space felt different, alive with the sound of progress. There was still much to be done, but it felt good. More than good, it felt right. Lorenzo rolled up his sleeves and joined the crew. He worked alongside them, offering help where he could, but more than that, he felt a sense of pride in what they were doing. It wasn't just about repairing the house, it was about making it a home. And more than that, it was about making sure that Finn and his family had a future. The day moved quickly as the crew continued to work. The air was filled with the sounds of hammering, drilling, and the occasional burst of laughter. Lorenzo found himself working alongside Thatcher, who had become a steady presence throughout the project. "You're doing good, Mr. Lorenzo," Thatcher said with a grin as they took a break. "You're getting the hang of this." Lorenzo chuckled, wiping sweat from his forehead. "I never thought I'd be doing this kind of thing again. But it feels good, better than I expected." Thatcher gave him a nod of approval. "You're part of the team now, Mr. Lorenzo. That's what matters." As the day wore on, the progress became more and more evident. The new floors were going in, and the kitchen plumbing was almost complete. There was still work to be done, but it was starting to feel like the house was taking shape. The repairs had brought the family closer together, and the changes made were more than just physical, they were emotional. There was a sense of security now, a sense of hope that had been missing before. Later in the afternoon, Elowen came out with drinks and snacks for everyone. As she handed them out, Lorenzo noticed the way she looked at the house. Her eyes were filled with gratitude, but there was something else, too. There was a quiet peace that he hadn't seen before. "Thank you for everything, Lorenzo," Elowen said, her voice soft but full of emotion. "This what you're doing for us, it's more than we ever expected. We're so grateful." Lorenzo looked at her, feeling a warmth in his chest. "You don't need to thank me, Elowen. You've given me something too. Something I didn't even realize I was missing." Elowen smiled, her eyes softening. I think we've both learned a lot over the past few days. Lorenzo nodded, his gaze shifting to Finian, who was playing with some of the tools. The boy had already started imagining what his new room would look like, even though it wasn't quite finished. His eyes sparkled with excitement, and Lorenzo couldn't help but think about how much potential was in that boy. He had so much ahead of him, and Lorenzo knew that Finian's future would be brighter because of what they were doing today. As the day began to wind down, the crew packed up for the night. The house was starting to feel more like a home. The repairs were not quite finished, but they were close. And as Lorenzo stood on the porch, looking out at the changes, he realized something important. This project was more than just about fixing a house. It was about fixing something inside himself, too. Elowen came out to join him, standing quietly beside him. "It's looking good," she said, her voice calm. Lorenzo smiled, looking at the house. "It is. And it's only going to get better." Elowen glanced at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "You've given us more than we could have ever imagined, Lorenzo. You've given us a future." Lorenzo nodded, his voice steady. "It's not just about the house, Elowen. It's about what's inside. You've reminded me of that. And I think—" He paused, looking out at the setting sun. "This is just the beginning." The sun dipped lower in the sky as the workers gathered their things and left for the day. Finian, still full of energy, ran over to Lorenzo, his eyes shining. "You're coming back tomorrow, right?" he asked, practically bouncing on his feet. Lorenzo laughed softly. "Of course, Finian. I'm here for the long haul." Finian smiled brightly. "Great! I can't wait to see the rest of it." As the last car drove off, the house stood in the evening light, glowing with promise. It wasn't just about the repairs. It was about the journey they had taken together. And for the first time in a long time, Lorenzo felt like he was exactly where he needed to be.